All right, I'm back. Sorry about that, but guess I was overwhelming my PC. So today's session is actually going to be a very short one. Morning yet again, it's Wukona. And today's the last session of our basics in terms of Node. There's a couple of things that I think are very important for you guys to know, but it's just going to be two things here and there. So, a moment. As I try to open the window again. All right, which file are we in? Hmm, Okay, I have no idea, but I think this is the one. Hopefully, it is the correct one because right now I have a lot of things happening in my code. So a quick recap on everything that we have covered so far. We looked at how to actually create our own modules, which is what we're doing yesterday. So we created the file manager module, which was actually also importing a lot of functions from the Node file system uh, module, which allows us to actually interact with files that we have locally on a PC if you're running the script on a local PC. So in this case, we're creating the JSON file, which had our list of students, as well as these other ones, which we never really utilized. And then in terms of this file, we used the code to create the file. Where are you? We use this code to actually create the file. And then after that, we covered how to double check if there's any data and actually create some sort of structure for the data you're going to be working with. So in this case, we just created three arrays which were empty. One was the list of students, the books, and the classes. But like I said, we never really looked into all of that. And then we looked at how to, but that we looked at how to actually receive the information from the file using read file sync, and then also how to actually make it readable, because if you just read this data on its own is actually not usable. So you actually have to manipulate it into a format that can actually be used programmatically. And you also cannot really read it as a human being. So in order to actually make sure that we can read that, we're using JSON parse so that we can actually either in this instance, we're actually just returning it. So JSON parse gave us that object, which is all of this data. But then because we only wanted the student array, we went ahead and actually stepped into using the dot notation. So I'm sure that you remember from JavaScript, if you have an object and then maybe dot name, this is called dot notation. So we use the dot notation in order to grab the list of students. And then we also had one function which was listening for if there's a parameter, meaning that I only want to fetch one specific student in this case. So it was more or less the same as this function, but then now we actually had to filter it out. So it still returned an array, but in this case, it was an array of one item. And obviously, because of how we wrote our code, this could actually have multiple results because we had duplicates. But like I did mention yesterday, if you're working with data, you need to make sure that you double check as you are sending data. If you're writing your own server, that is, you need to make sure that you double check if the IDs don't actually conflict with one another, because otherwise you have multiple people who apparently have the same ID, which is nonsensical. But we're not doing that because that would actually add to the time we would have to have on the session. We also looked at how to delete a student by utilizing the same ID, which was similar to this function right here. So it was all of that, and then we actually used the filter method. But in this case, with the student, we were only reading. So here we were reading, so we didn't update the actual file. But then I remember mentioning that this and this is similar. Meanwhile, this side, we actually just want to bring back, if we find a student who has an ID that matches the ID that we just passed, we want to go ahead and return that, but it doesn't actually update the actual file. But when it comes to the delete student, what we're doing is now the opposite. We're actually looking at all the students who have an ID that doesn't match the ID that we just sent it. So I remember Caesar did cover this part. This is what that means. So essentially, student in this case, let me put it right here. In filter, student is an object. And because it's an object, that means student has these properties. There's the age, there's the name, there's surname, as well as the ID. So that's why I have student.id here. And then this is basically saying equals to, but because we're using the exclamation mark before, remember exclamation mark in programming is used to negate whatever you're going to write on the right. And by negate, I mean make negative, right? So whatever you have on the right, if it's checking for if something is equal, that means this is actually going to turn into the opposite. There's multiple ways to write this. I'm going on a tangent here, but there's multiple ways to write this. It depends on how comfortable you are with your syntax, because you can also negate it outside. But the other way is cleaner, but I've seen people do it the other way and it still works. So we're just checking for that. But because we have to delete after getting the data, we now needed to make use of the write file function with the updated object. So we updated the object. We updated the object, and then we sent the updated data. In this case, it's an object, and overrode pre-existing file data. So remember, I did say each and every time you use the write file, you are actually overriding the data. So it makes it easier to actually manipulate files. Whatever you do on your code, you just override the file. At that point, you don't really care what's in the file because you're working with the data at the side. So whatever data you have here should always be the data that you want to store. But the issue with that, you make a mistake in terms of how you're updating it, or you're deleting something, but you made a mistake. That means even when you update the site, you're actually going to have messy data. For example, if this didn't make sense and then I was only returning one student, for example, the one that I actually want to remove, that means I would only be left with the one student I wanted to delete. And I compared this guy to where are you with this function, which adds this adds to the file. So this is perfect. In our case, we used it to have preset data. In this case, our data structure. Structure. My brain is not braining. Feels like I wrote the wrong word, but anyway. So we're using it to have preset data in the case of our empty arrays. But this is also something that you can use if you're not working with your JSON file. For example, if you're working with list of items, whereby, let me show you an example. I didn't really cover this yesterday, but let's say maybe we have something like nodes.txt, and then at the top you are saying length way of using Node to manipulate files. In this case, because it's a proper list, you can actually make use of append file, which is just going to add more data at the bottom and so on and so forth. So everything will actually be step by step. But because JSON has nested items, you cannot append because, as you saw yesterday, if we append, we're going to end up having something like this. Actually, that's not valid JSON. We end up having something like this, and then you have new student here, which messes up the file structure. So both of them can be used. It depends on the use case. Always remember, there's always many ways to do one thing, but in order to actually figure out what you need to use, you need to figure out first what it is that you're trying to achieve. So in my case, append file, only used it once. There's something that can be used in scenarios where you have non-nested lists, because they're easy to actually manage that way. And then we also looked at how to update a student. And then in this case, we were using the .map because remember, JSON data.student is actually an array. So whatever we have, let's do this, JSON data. Okay, sorry about my typing, guys. I'm a little bit cold. It's cold where I am, so I'm kind of freezing. So my fingers are not doing the right thing today. So JSON student is an array. So all array methods are valid and can be used. So that's why I was using the .map. And then with the .map, remember, .map actually allows you to, what it does is it returns an array, right? That's why we're actually overriding JSON data.student by mapping through the pre-existing one. So it returns an array, and then inside internally, meaning in the block of code in the .map, you can manipulate the data that you have. So you can manipulate the data however you wish. In this case, we're checking if the student matches the student ID that we're passing, and then updating that object by returning a new object. So it returns a new object in that specific index, whereby it finds that this condition is actually true by using the data that we passed it. Otherwise, it returns the same exact object in that index. So if we don't find the match, we're just ignoring everything. Again, this is not the only way to go around this. And then after doing all of that, remember this is only existing in our code. So we had to go ahead and actually make updates or override our file yet again. And then we also added a student. So in terms of adding a student, because we cannot just go straight to appending, we are forced to read first. So we were reading the file to actually see what we have. And because JSON data.students is an array, we're able to just use push. So it was adding the new student just at the end of the student array. And then as per usual, we needed to overwrite the file with the new data that we have. So this is what we focused on. And then in terms of this, exports dot get students becomes the name of the function. But with exports dot, we are now saying we actually want this function to be accessible outside of this specific file, which allowed us to let me see. Yes, which allowed us to actually read. In this case, we're using create file when we run the server. And then on the student request, we were actually using the rest of the functions, which are up here. So this is how we're able to actually access our own code, which we're making use of on the other side. And the reason for this is, as you can see, this file on its own is, wow, it's actually over 100 lines, but obviously the spaces in between. And there's also code we don't need because there's a lot of console logs in some um, areas. But what I'm saying is we have a lot of code, and then we also have the entry file. If we have all the code in just here, our project will still work, sure enough, but then it makes it messy and harder to read because remember when we started, we had everything that we're trying to do down here. So we actually started by removing this and making that a function, and then we created its own file where we actually handle everything. And as you can see, this is a bit more readable. If students, we know we're handling the request, but right now I don't really care what happens with that, but I know that if the path is not, then this is what happens. So for readability, that's how you can actually do it. At this point, though, this is also still a bit messy because you can also create folders for related things that you're actually doing. In this case, when you have your database JSON, if you're going to be using multiple of them to actually store different data, you can even create a folder just for that, create a folder for this kind of files, which could be just helper functions, and so on and so forth. In my case, I'm doing everything all in the same level. So I do not recommend this. But let me see, what else did we look at that I might not have? Okay. We also looked at the JSON object, which we actually use a lot when it comes to programming. When you're using JavaScript, you're going to see this guy quite a lot, even though the one that we use in JavaScript is not exactly the same as this, because like I said, in JavaScript, we can have that, we can have this, right? And then the value. Meanwhile, a valid JSON object would actually be more like this. No single quotations, everything is in double quotations, unless if you're writing a number, then you're allowed to actually just have a number inside. But in terms of the key, it's still going to be double quotations. So we looked at that and then we said you can use your JSON object, okay, to use in JavaScript to store data like we were using it before, to store your data temporarily, but it's also used in APIs to send and receive data. And by this, let me see, where are you? This is our JSON object. I'm receiving the data that's coming back from the API. This side, I'm actually sending it to the server. So that's one use case of the JSON object. It's also used for settings. In this case, the package.json, the file that got created when we initialized our project. Remember, initializing our project is npm init. It creates this file for us with all these things in it. I'll come back to this file as we continue today because I still owe you something regarding that. And then go back, go back, go back. We also said it's used for data storage, like more permanent data storage, which is not volatile. In this case, our database.json. So this is everything that we actually went through yesterday. So today we're just going to be continuing from that. And as you can see, when it comes to how we are actually managing our paths, this does get a little bit messy. This does get a bit messy. Nope, I'm not looking for you. So if you look at this, there's a lot of if statements everywhere. And this was not that, it was not that big of a program. But now imagine if you're actually working with a whole code base. So a very big project, and this is how you're writing. For this kind of issues, we have something called Express. So in terms of Express, let me go this side. I'm gonna go to Express. Okay, we're looking for Express JS. So this guy, I hope you can see. So this is a third-party library that actually helps us with managing our routes. I'm going to show you how it works, but it actually makes everything so simple. As you can see here for our get, there's no if statement. We have our app.get, and then it's listening to the root path, and then it just sends back hello world, and then we have app.listen. And then we don't actually have to set up our local host in this case, or the host name. That's done automatically in the background. All we need to be worried about is the port. So as you can see, this seems a bit more simpler. So in order to actually make use of this, so far we've actually been using modules that we have created, as well as the ones that come with Node. But there is this guy. So npm is a registry for all packages, libraries that you might actually want to make use of. Like right now, I was just talking about Express, but it's also part of this registry. So if I come to this, okay, let me see if there we are. Okay, it doesn't want to open. Okay, I think my internet is a bit slow. So, okay, I have no idea what's happening in terms of the README file here, but this is actually how you find some of these libraries if you're looking for something. In this case, they also have their own website aside, and there's this command. So for this, you need to open a terminal. In my case, I'm going to be typing this in the same terminal as where I'm running everything else. So remove that. And then I'm going to come this side and then paste. So this is npm install express dash dash save. And then that's going to actually add this library so that we can actually use it in our code. And as you can see, Git is telling me that this has been updated. And then when we come to it, we now have an object called dependencies. And then in the dependencies, we have express. Actually, let me zoom in a bit because I think this is a bit too small. So we have the dependencies with express, and then on the right side, we actually have the version. As much as this is something that I'm showing you in Node, most projects that you're going to work on are heavily dependent on this object. And one mistake sometimes in regards of this, then the whole project runs into errors. So it's very important to actually make sure that you keep an eye out for this. And we have the version at the top. I'm not sure if I did explain this initially. This specifies the version that we're currently working on. By default, it's set to 1.0.0. You can update that however you want before you actually publish. And then we have the main. In this case, main is just telling us what file is our entry file. Obviously, this is still saying index, but I stopped using that a long time ago and I started using student server. But in terms of when you're hosting, is there specific code base to your on render or any other deployment services? This is where they're actually looking to double check which file they're supposed to be running. So because I'm doing it locally, that's okay. But if you're going to be hosting, you might actually want to go ahead and update this before you host. And then in terms of the scripts, we don't have any scripts at the moment, but these are scripts that you use to actually say, okay, so if someone types maybe npm start, for example, this is supposed to start the actual program. So if I am to show you an example of this, let's have start. And then in terms of our start, this is, that needs to be a comma. This will be node dash dash watch, wrong spelling, watch, and then the name of the file. In this case, we're using student server, student server.js, and then we save that. We come back this side. I'm just going to run npm start. If we run into a problem, okay, there we go. So as you can see, I didn't need to type all this out because it's now looking at the script. So the script can actually do a lot of things. Sometimes you
Vukana,
can also, yes.
sorry for intercepting. Jan has his hand up and it's been up for like a long time now.
Mm, okay,
Okay.
you can come in.
Yeah, let's talk to Jan. Hi, Jan. Morning, Jan. Okay, it seems as if like the mic doesn't work. His mic doesn't work.
But if he has had his hand up for the longest time, I think he can also try to type something in the chat and then you let me know.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Vukana.
All right, cool. So this is what the package JSON is all about. It actually has the settings for our project, the properties, and things that we need to be aware of in terms of our project, the license. For now, we don't need to be bothered about this, but if you're going to be writing software which is open sourced, this is where you actually say, okay, this is the kind of license that we have, and these are the rules that govern it, because ISC actually made something. That license meant something specific. In the community, you can have your author. We don't have any of that. The description, you can just have a short description about the project. And since we have this guy installed, we can now actually make use of it. But because I don't want to delete any of my previous code, that means we're going to create another file yet again. And in this case, I'm just going to call it Express or Express Server because I am running out of new names that I'm sure supposed to be using. So we have that, and then I'm going to come back to this side and let's say run express. So in this case, it's going to be copy and paste of this, but we're going to update the file name. And for those who are wondering why this is important for you, it saves you time. Sometimes you actually have a lot of scripts that you need to run in your project. So if you just do it like this, run express, it does that for you automatically. If you want the normal one, however, just run that and it still works. So in this case, we are now going to say npm run express. Okay, did I make any? Okay, this is supposed to be npm run express. So that is up and running. As you can see, we have that, but I currently don't have anything in our Express code. So let's go ahead and set this up. If we come back to this guy, as you can see, it already gave us sample code that we can actually use. We can just copy this, and then I'll explain what's actually happening as I make updates to the code. So you already know what this does by now. We are importing. We're importing. I remember someone I asked if there's a difference between importing and require. It's more or less the same thing. It's just a different method because of whatever version of EJS that you're currently using. But you can actually set up a project to use import instead of require. So we have import. So this is importing Express. So we can actually make use of it. And then this side, it's creating an instance of our server. So remember we had http.create server with this library makes everything way, way easier. So app equals to Express creates that instance of the server for us. So this creates server instance. And then the rest you understand, I'll come back to this, but the rest I'm sure you understand. We have the port like we did the other time, and then we have app.listen. So on the other side, we're creating a server, right? And then we say server.listen and then everything else. But now because app is the server instance, we have app.listen. But obviously this is just a variable, so you can name it anything that you want. But it's standard practice for it to be, it is standard practice for it to be app, but it doesn't really matter. It's just a variable. So you can call it whatever you want. And then in terms of this, on the other side, remember we actually needed to listen using if statements on the create server. So in this case, we only need to call the server instance and then tell it what method we want to listen to. So in this case, when we have it like this, it's going to listen to a get request on the entry or the root directory, root path of our server. So let's see, let me save this. Because now we're going to be working with Express, we are not going to be touching on the file manager that we actually wrote yesterday, but you can actually connect it on your side if you want to. I'm trying to keep this simple. So I want to get request. Wait. This is running on 3000. I think I already have something on 3000, so I need to update that. So now remove that and make a request. As you can see, it's saying hello world. So that is actually running. But let us see what happens if I type anything else. As you can see, cannot get, and then the route. And this is also another thing that I actually like when it actually comes to Express. When a route does not exist, at least you have this. It comes back and it actually shows you that this route doesn't actually exist. So you can go ahead and actually handle it the way you want to properly. But for what we want the other three methods, the put, the post, as well as the delete. And I'm going to be showing you how to do similar things that we did when we're using HTTP straight up. Not get, this is supposed to be, let's say, put. And then we have it right. Actually, I'm going to start using students like we did at the time. So student, and then we have our request object as well as our response object. Maybe I never explained this before, but rec is request, and then res is actually short for response. So this handles everything to do with data coming into the server, so incoming and then this is outgoing. So you always need to have them, otherwise you won't be able to access them. In that callback, you need to make sure that they are there so that you can actually get data that's coming in, whether it's a parameter like we had yesterday or it's a search query. And I think I didn't cover the search query, so it's something that I'll also cover today. Here we are just going to have can just have rest.send and then say not that message updated, and then I'm going to have another one for the post. We have our reg, and then we have our res, and then we have that. So I'm just gonna copy this. We have this side, and then this is posted. And then we have we have get put post. So we're going to have delete. So this is also supposed to be student. And then our rec, res. Yeah, we have that. So this is going to be deleted. So let's just double check if this actually gets hit. So we should actually get this information back. So we have that, we have our put. Let's go ahead. As you can see, it says that does not exist at the moment. We'll come back and fix that. Let's send, and then as you can see, it says updated. We have our delete. We need to remove that because that is not recognized. And then we have deleted. Wait, did we have post? Not yet. Okay, it says it cannot post because we are not using the right endpoint. So that is supposed to be students, and we have that information. And again, Express can actually kind of determine implicitly the kind of data that you're actually working with. When we're working with the with HTTP, we actually needed to set the exact body type. But as you can see with this one, it actually understands what kind of data you're sending. So it automatically assigned JSON type to our response. So this is the power of using Express. So now we're done with the handling part. What happens with when we're getting, okay, you already know how to get, we don't really have a lot of things to worry about here. But then what happens if you wanted to get one specific student like we did yesterday? Well, for this, there's something interesting that you can actually do. You can come here and have this. So in this case, ID becomes a variable, and I'll show you how that works. But again, you can call it whatever. The important thing is you use the semicolon. So what happens is when you use the semicolon after the forward slash, then it knows that it actually needs to look, this needs to be the parameter. And what I mean by that is, let's console log this. We're coming to this guy, and then we're going to say rec.params. So this is going to be the parameter that we actually have. Let's come this side. So that was a get request. So it's get request students with whatever random data you want to put. So if we send it, it just says hello world. Okay, that's because I have hello world. But on the console, as you can see, we now have ID. But like I'm saying, it doesn't really matter what you call it because this is like a variable. So it will work regardless of the name you give it. If I send, as you can see, now it's called student ID. So we can actually grab that data and say const student ID equals to rec dot params dot student ID. And this is what I meant by it becomes a variable. Even VS Code actually recognizes that this is now a variable. That's why this is different from the other ones. The other ones are just ABCs, mean that this looks like this. So this is actually recognized. So we now have that ID. Obviously, we are not writing a full blown server like we did yesterday, but this is where you would handle the request and return data. So this is where you go ahead and do it, but this is how you would actually set the parameter to say, I want this specific student. Meanwhile, this is fetching all of them. So this fetches a specific student by use of the parameter. So in this case, it's a parameter. The parameter is called student ID. And remember student if student ID, and remember not semicolon, the colon is important. This is what actually says what's about to follow is the actual parameter I want to make use of. So we have that. Now, when it comes to putting, obviously, you do more or less the same thing. You would actually need to have the ID so you can identify what resource exactly are you updating. And then with posting, we don't really need that, but then we need to be able to fetch our information. So our information is actually under rec dot body. So let's say data equals to rec dot body. Let's console log our data. So when we're actually trying to make a request to students, we should be able to have that information. Let us see what happens. Currently, it says undefined. Why? Because right now we haven't set up our server to be able to read from rec.body. So there have been many ways to actually do this, but the current way to actually do it is app.use, and then you're going to call express to complete express.json. And what this does, it allows for you to actually read your JSON data. So now let's come back to this side. We hit send, and now we have access to that information. But obviously, this only is used to read JSON data that you're actually sending using this method. If you're using the other methods, you will actually have to set up a server to be able to read that information. But because we're not working with form data or the form URL encoded, we're using raw JSON data. This is what I'm going to be looking at. But this is just for JSON body data. Other data need different handlers. So this is specific to the data that we're currently working with, and we now can read that information. So now have access to it, and like I said with the get request, down here you now have to handle the request. And add student to database. So in terms of the functionality we're working on yesterday, you can still plug in, we can still plug them in here instead of actually using them on the other server if you prefer this way of actually doing it. But this is the recommended because it's actually easier to read compared to using HTTP. And all it's actually doing, all Express is doing is it's actually wrapping around HTTP, because HTTP is kind of a nightmare in long code bases. they are wrapping around it to actually make it more manageable. So that's what the library is actually all about, making your life easier, and it's actually dealing with your routes, like I mentioned. So obviously delete will follow the same logic with the put as well as the get. You would need to grab the ID. So you cannot just delete students, because according to this setup, this seems like you're deleting the whole students list, which in most cases is not what you want to do. For delete purposes, you usually delete one by one. So you'd also need to pass the ID using the parameter. Now let's go to the other thing that I didn't do yesterday, which is on get request. Sometimes I did mention that sometimes you want to be specific to a specific ID, right? You are passing, because you know the ID itself of the specific student, all you want is their data. But what if what you're searching for maybe is, let's say you're searching for people with a specific name. So this in programming is what's called the query. I'm sure you've seen this. It's on Take a Lot. Any website that you actually work with, even Google itself, when you search for something, it actually appears right at the top. So let us see. What can we say? Let's say BMW. Doesn't appear like it was supposed to, but it used to be up here with the query and all of that. But we can use Take a Lot for this. Let's go into the website. And then let's search for hard drive. Might be off ramping a bit, but it's very important for people to actually understand URLs and all of that. So in this case, what we have, question mark, signifies the fact that we are now about to set up our query parameters. So in this case, we have all of this, which I have no idea what it's all about, but our main focus is the Q search. So this is saying this is the query that the user has actually searched for, and it's equals to hard drive 1 TB. So that's what I'm also going to do and show you how to actually read that directly in your server. So let's have query. We'll pretend we're actually looking for the name. So we can, let's say, corner. So when we send that, at the current moment, nothing actually happens when we send that. So what we need to do, come to this guy right here. How do we read that information? Well, that information exists in rec.query, right? Rec.query. So if we come back to Postman, hit send, we now have query right over there. But as you saw before, in terms of Take a Lot at least, you can actually have multiple queries that you're actually looking for. In this case, you can also write them over here if you prefer that approach. So we can actually even say age equals to 33. We can have another one, say, okay, I don't know, male, maybe equals to true. Can, and then we hit that, and then now, as you can see, we have all these queries actually showing up. So why is this important? Well, if you want to get data, but filter according to some criteria, this is how you'd actually do it. So you still want all of the students, but only if they match the specific thing that you're looking for. If they don't match, then you don't want them to be shown. Meanwhile, if you just have it like this, it's going to return the whole list. So that is done. That is done. That is how you actually work with Express. There's more ways. This is just the basics of working with Express. It gets a bit more complicated when you actually continue working with it, because you can also break down most of this and have different files like we did yesterday, whereby you actually say, on this file, I just want to listen to when they make a request to students. And then on the separate file, you want to check if it was a post request, if it was a get request, are there parameters that are being sent. But I think in terms of the basics, this is pretty much it. Now, in terms of the data that we're sending back, so far we're only sending, we're sending JSON, we sent the plain text, and what else? I think that's pretty much it in terms of the data. But like I said the other time, you can actually send more than that kind of data. So for example, when we are getting, which one do I want to work with? Let's say with this one. When we are here, I am going to use, I think this one, is it called the grave? It has many names, but I think the other name is called the grave. I have no idea why. So I'm going to use the grave so that I can actually have multiple lines. I don't like the structure. What did I do? So we can actually have multiple lines down here. So we are going to do a bit of dark magic. We can have HTML also, and then we can have a body. And then obviously we need to close the text. We always need to make sure that they're closed. So here I'm just going to have an H1, and then first time using NodeJS. Let's close that, and then we have H1. Let us double check if this is actually working. Oh, 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 oh. So right on the root file, as you can see, this is now HTML. And because it's HTML, that means we can actually open that. Let me come back this side. We can also open it directly on the website. So this is actually going to look like an HTML file. So you can actually have all your data down here. But obviously this is not the best way to actually go about it. This is not the best way to go about it. What you can do, you can create a file. Let me see. We can call this index.html. And then in index, I'm going to use that. And then we have our code in there. And then this side, we are going to say, okay, so this is supposed to be h1. Hi there. And then you can actually have, remember you're working with lists when you're working on HTML, so we can actually also have that. I'm not going to be doing any styling, by the way. Hi, bonjour. Copy that. So we have that. But because this is a file, we need to be able to read it in order to then send it to the user. So for this, you would actually do something like, okay. I think I need to start closing some of this because I don't know what changes I've made on that. Um, it's fine, save. Okay, let's come back to this. And instead of send, because now we want to actually work with files, we need to use something called send file. But we also need to be able to get the path first of all. So we're going to use the module that we used just to do called path. So with this path, it actually allows us to read the paths on the PC because we need to be able to point to this file right here. So for that, we can remove this guy and then have send file. And then as you can see, it now wants the path. So if I remember correctly, this is path.draw. Need to double check something. We need to use their name. So their name is directory name. This is actually part of Node.js. I didn't code this, but it actually allows you to, let's do this. Let's have their name over there. Then here we are now going to actually point to the actual file that we want, which in this case is index.html. So we need to make sure that we have that index.html. Save that. So this is student. Let us see if we got everything correct. As you can see, we have our HTML file. So in terms of the dir, as you can see, it's the whole path that is actually pointing to where this project is actually running. So it gets that for you, and then it joins it with this to actually give it basically the full path for that specific file. So this is what's called absolute paths, by the way. And we now have this HTML. So we're now actually using straight up HTML instead, HTML file instead of actually writing it ourselves. So you might be asking yourself, why am I showing you the fact that you can also use Node to actually display HTML pages? Well, because it has many use cases. In some cases, you're actually using it to run web apps, meaning that you can actually display web pages when something actually happens on the app. If they go to this specific route, show them this page. When they click on that button, send data back to our form, handle the form, and then redirect them to whatever page. But we are not deep diving into that. We are going to stop here in terms of that. I just wanted you to know that Node actually does have the potential to actually go ahead and do that, other than just showing us JSON data in the form of an API. So let me see if I am missing anything in terms of our session today. We've covered the path, which allows us to actually read information on about our server, and also allows us to actually set specific paths. Like in this case, we're actually joining the absolute path of our project and then combining it with the file name to actually create an absolute path for the actual file that we want to open. We looked at the different methods, how to set up different methods in Express using app.post, your app.delete, app.put, app.get. We also looked at how to get information if it's being passed in the form of a parameter like we did yesterday, whereby we specify a specific ID, which in this case actually becomes simpler, as you can see. We also have the query, yes. So this is the information that I was looking for. If a person is actually sending information, maybe searching, this is usually used for searching or filtering. So we have rect.query, we looked at rect.params, which is this guy. And we also looked at how to receive information by using rect.body. So like I said, rect.body receives data on, on our request. So we've done that. We've done the other part. Huh. Yeah. That is pretty much it in terms of today's session. Like I said, today we're actually just wrapping up. And I thought I was actually going to take a bit longer than expected, but it wasn't that long after all. So this is one way to actually write your entry file to make sure that it actually becomes more readable compared to the other things that we're doing. I'm looking for a student server compared to the other things whereby we actually had to read the path, even when we actually had to get the param ID. Well, in terms of my approach, it becomes a nightmare. Meanwhile, with the Express server, this is all you actually have to do. This already tells it what it needs to do, and all you have to do is actually come to the side and read that information. So this is what I wanted you guys to have a look into today, as well as how to actually send HTML files. Also, you're not limited in terms of the files that you're sending. I just decided to focus on HTML because we've been working with HTML, but you can actually send other files as well. So for those who are curious, you can actually still go ahead and play around with other files, using it maybe as a download server, for example. That's up to you. Mahlatsi, do we have any questions?
No, we don't have any questions. Caesar covered the question from Jan, and then I don't know if they want to ask you any questions at the moment. You can just raise your hand if you have a question for Vukona. All right, we don't have any questions for you, Vukona.
All right, perfect. But like I said, guys, this is not the only things that you can actually do with Node. I just decided not to dive a bit too deep into most of the concepts because at the same time, I'm also worried about maybe overwhelming you with too much information in just 1 week. Like, for example, what I was saying in terms of the data, you can actually send data to this file directly from your server and back and forth. But then the setup for that actually becomes a bit more complex. But for those who are interested in looking into it, please look into, okay, this is not the proper comment for, boom, 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 boom. For those who want to look into it, you can look into AJS and what do they call it? Templating engines. This is what helps you to be able to actually send information to your HTML files as well as actually receiving it back. But that also has its own learning curve. And with that said, thank you guys for joining us in the last session. And I'm glad I could actually cover this in less than 2 hours. So you guys will actually have enough time to get the task and actually get started on it. But it will be a continuation of what we've already started in terms of task NodeJS task one. So you're going to get your task today, and it's going to be adding a bit of complexity on it. So you guys be on the lookout, and this is me signing off. Mahlatsi, back to you.
All right, thank you so much, Vukona, for that. Do we have any other questions besides the one for the session? All right, no questions. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. See you in the next session and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
All right, cheers. Wait, I think there's a question.
Okay, okay, okay. It only, yeah, they only sent it now. All right. So, Mohammed, are we going to work with the REST APIs? Will we use Postman for testing?
In terms of the task that I'm going to give, I do have something simple at the moment, but I am thinking, should I make it a bit more complex or not? So I haven't fully decided yet, but you'll find out in just a few hours.
All right. I guess that was the last question. Joseph is saying, thank you so much. Yeah, I don't know how to say this. Chokona. And then Joseph says Vukona. So thank you so much, Vukona, for that.
I think I also saw a hand from Aloani, and to the guy saying thanks you so much, my pleasure.
The hand is not there. Aluan, I'm unmuting your mic.
Hi,
Yes, Aluan.
Mahlatsi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. No, I just wanted to ask if are we having a session tomorrow?
Aluan.
Um,
Okay, here's Vukona.
um, I think Mahlatsi can correct me on this. I think we might have a session, but it has nothing to do with Node.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, with Node, this is where I end. I am done.
All right. And thank you for the information.
Yeah, I just hope it wasn't too much for you guys. Because as I'm going through this, I'm trying to give enough information, but then without it being too much.
Yeah, it was a lot, but obviously then one will have to go through the recordings again just to, practice.
All right, now I think that's understandable.
Yeah.
All right. Tomorrow we do have a session, but it's going to be based on scoping. The final project, we're going to give you the project scope, and then I don't think it's going to be long, but yeah, that's tomorrow's session. But I've already sent invitations to everyone for that session. Can you also just try to check your emails, Aluane? I've sent invitations for that.
All right, thank you.
All right, that's where we ended today. Thank you so much for joining. See you in the next session. Bye bye.